It sure does. It sure does. Well, Igor, I know our time is quickly running, escaping. And so maybe let's just shift gears just for a second. I know a lot of us with access to Twitter and a wide variety of communication tools, Telegram, etc. We've been given a pretty blow by blow sometimes of people in their attempts to escape Ukraine and to travel into, Poland and countries beyond. And generally speaking, the borders do allow, obviously, Ukrainian citizens to travel outside, but we know that there are massive lineups. It's not like people just stream across the border without any assessment or any establishment of identity and things like that. So what have you heard about that for people who are trying to make their way, and do you have any thoughts or suggestions for them?
So I wanted in that context talk about people who flee the country into Poland. Just the background of what's happening. There are a lot of volunteers who meet people at the train station in Lviv. They transport people for free to the border with Poland. And then as you cross the border with Poland, there was a question whether you can only have a passport. To answer that question, I would ask you, Mark, to open one of the links. I think I sent it to you in Teams. It's pomocpratna.org. So as we shared the screen, there's information in Ukrainian language, but I'll translate it into English. If you can show it on the screen, that would be helpful for those people who have trouble understanding English.
I am in the process of waiting for
enter Poland.
Good old Teams to open up here. Just give me a second, Igor, and I'll grab that link. Is this the page, Igor?
Yeah, and then keep scrolling. I'll tell you where to stop. Yep, keep scrolling. Okay, so you can stop here. Okay. So I'll be reading from my screen. So you can enter Poland based on visa-free regime. If you have biometric passport, you can enter if you have visa D or Schengen C visa. If you have Mark D or C, or you have any other travel document issued by a Schengen country, if you have a permit for temporary residence or permanent residence, or you have what they call Rezydentstwo Unii Europejskiej, so that is the European Union resident card, or a valid permanent resident card, Karta Pobytu. Then you can enter Poland if you have an application for international protection that you apply for at the border. So when you get to the border, you can submit that application, or if you have an agreement, like an approval from the officer of the border service when you cross the border. And then the next paragraph that is depicted on the screen right now is documents that you need to enter Poland. Due to the war in Ukraine, all foreign nationals, especially from Ukraine, can evacuate from the territory of Ukraine using one of the documents that serve as an ID, which is passport, even if it's expired. You do not need to have visa. You can use the ID card, which is the internal passport, like the national passport, even if that ID card is expired. You can also use a birth certificate for your child. And then using these documents, you can identify yourself. It's recommended that you have any other documents that can identify yourself. And then you do not need to have any COVID test, which is quite good given the context we live in. Then you can also, I think, apply for refugee protection in Poland with the Unhcr. But I'm not an expert in this matter, and I think Anna would be a good contact, right? Because I just don't want to say something that is not true or inaccurate. But what I can say for sure is that again, documents that you can use to so when you enter Poland and you ask for refugee protection there, so you will receive documents such as the Geneva travel document, which will be valid for 2 years. You can then replace the document in a urząd. Urząd is a think about it as an immigration administration in Poland. Then you can receive afterwards. You can receive a Polish travel document which will be valid for 1 year. It will be given to you by voivoda. Voivoda is again a think about him as a head of the urząd in Poland. So he's one of the chief officers who will approve the documents. If like this Polish travel document will be given to you only if you are unable to get passports of your country, but you have to prove it. And then afterwards, like in the perspective, you can get a temporary resident card on the basis that you are a refugee. This temporary resident card will be given to you for 3 years. And the card for additional protection will be given to you for 2 years after 5 years of being in the status of the refugee in Poland. So after 5 years, you may get a permanent resident document, and they will open up the pathway for you to get a permanent resident document in Poland, and then from that you can even transition to citizenship eventually. Now, what you need to know when you cross the border with Poland. So apply for ask volunteers. There will be tons of volunteers at the border. Ask them about refugee protection status in Poland. They will direct you to the responsible person and give you more information. But what you have to know about what you need, a lot of people are wondering about the money. So does it cost anything? Like, will they need to have money? And how it's going to go. So foreign nationals who receive a refugee status in Poland and additional protection can use that protection and help that will be given to them for 12 months in accordance with so-called Individual Integration Program, IPI. While your application is being reviewed, you will receive either a housing and food so that you can maintain like in camp for refugees, or you can abandon your option to stay in a camp. And if you do that, you will be given an allowance, which will be given to you for the duration of this individual integration program, which lasts 12 months. You will be receiving a allowance from 721 zloty to 1450 zloty per month. That money will need to be used to find housing and to purchase food for yourself. But the amount that you will eventually receive will be determined individually. For the first 6 months after you cross the border with Poland, you are not authorized to work. And only then, after 6 months, since you applied for refugee status, you will be allowed to work on the same legal grounds as the citizens of Poland. So you may be able to sign a umowę o pracy, which is a work, kind of like a work job offer that allows you medical protection, and you will be an employee. There's also another type of work permit that they have. It's not umowę o pracę, it's umowę zlecenia. Umowę zlecenia is more like, think about it as a contractor. So you will not be given this medical protection, medical insurance, labor insurance, so you don't have too many rights, and your technically employer who signs a contractor agreement with you can fire you at any day. With umowę o pracę, which you will be eligible for after 6 months of being in Poland, you will not be fired the next day. So it's a huge benefit. And then again, so the protection and help with this individual integration program will be afforded to you based on the application that you submit to the starosta through Powiatowy Centrum Pomocy Rodzinom. That is the regional center for help to families. Within 60 days after you receive the status of refugee. I will share additional resources with people, and you may find links to them. They will be in Ukrainian language. You may find links to those resources in the description under this video. One of the really helpful resource that you will have to read if you want to apply for refugee protection in Poland is on the pomocprawna.org. It's in Ukrainian, so most of our Ukrainian speaking people will be able to understand it. In that resource, you will see the address of reception centers across Poland. You will see specific address. So when you come there and ask for help, they will direct you to the person who can give you more information. There are a lot of pro bono help right now taking place in Poland. My mom lives in Poland right now, and she just informed me of the crazy amount of help that Polish people provide to Ukrainians. And yes, that's pretty much it. And I'm sorry, I was talking, and then suddenly I'm like, oh, that's it. But that's not it. If I find any other information, again, every link will be posted in the description. So feel free to click on all of those or reach out to any of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have, I know there's a couple more questions. We'll finish off with a couple last questions, and then we'll wrap it up. We're definitely into overtime here. So I'm going to start with this one, and I think we'll pull Anna back in here. So this one is from Yaroslavna, and she says, could you please briefly explain about sponsorship refugee? So in the context of the war in Ukraine, would it be possible? Yes, I'm from Winnipeg, originally from Ukraine. My mom is there now. So obviously there's, I think, whether it's group of 5 or those kinds of things, Anna, maybe you can just briefly touch on that, because some people are wondering, is there something that I can do directly, above and beyond? And actually there was another comment here that I'll kind of combine both of these if I can find it. Just give me 1 second here. This was from Izzy, and she says, I'm from Edmonton. Thanks for the live chat. Is there something we can do here in YEG in addition to donating to humanitarian aid organizations? And I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking. And so maybe I'll just let that kind of segue into that, Anna.
Yeah, so I can speak about, so private sponsorship. So remember how I first said that a very common route for refugee resettlement is when the Canadian government takes charge and they receive these referrals from Unhcr or other large refugee recognizing entity in the third country. It is also possible for permanent residents and Canadian citizens in Canada to sponsor refugee privately, so they don't have to wait until Canadian government learns about these refugees and brings them to Canada. However, the same basic legal rules apply, which means that the person to be sponsored must be outside of Ukraine, and they must have the recognized refugee status in the country where they're right now residing. The only exception to this second requirement is if the individual or the family here in Canada, if they go through so-called sponsorship agreement holders. So it's a type of private refugee sponsorship where there's a large organization. Usually they are like big religious entities like churches. And so they have a long-standing relationships with the government where they have been sponsoring already refugees for many decades. And so there, the government recognizes that participation is already enough, where a formal recognition of the refugee status is not required. The list of the sponsorship agreement holders is on the RCC's website, and once I'm finished talking, I'll share the link, and so maybe Mark, you can share this link with our audience. Other than that, there's such a route called Group of Five. So any 5 adults in Canada who are citizens who are permanent residents, they don't have to be related by blood to each other. They don't have to be related to the person whom they are wanting to sponsor. So they can band together, pull the financial resources, put together a settlement plan, and they can sponsor a refugee. But there again, we go back to these basic fundamental rules that the refugee must be outside of Canada and they must be recognized as a refugee in a third country outside of Canada. So one of my expectations, maybe it's very ambitious to say expectations, but one of my hopes for the government's response to the escalating crisis in Ukraine is that they would waive the requirement of a formal refugee status for Ukrainian nationals who have fled. We have a precedent for that. It happened in 2015 when the Canadian government managed to resettle a massive number of Syrian refugees within a very short period of time. I believe there were about 25,000 of Syrian refugees resettled through government referred channels and through private sponsorship within the course of less than half a year.
Yeah.
And so there it was possible to a large extent because at that time the government issued a temporary public policy to waive the requirement of a formal refugee status for those Syrians who had fled Syria. And so like I said, the precedent has been set, so we know legally it is possible. Whether the government is going to do it or not, it remains to be seen. I understand that whenever this policy comes up for other situations of crisis, conflict in the world, the Canadian government is pretty cautious and they're afraid of the floodgate. Yeah, that once we kind of waive the requirement, there is just going to be this massive number of claims and applications, and we'll be just deluged and we'll just drown in this whole process. So we cannot do that. We have to find another way to kind of have sort of the levers against this possible floodgate.